earlier in the day on Fridays, but because we had someone from Australia joining us today, we thought we'd do it at a semi-reasonable time for him, who I'll introduce here in a minute. We're excited to have everyone here today. So while we're getting started, though, before I introduce Wayne to the live stream here today, for those of you that are watching live here today, if you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn or Twitter, if you wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat where you're watching from today. I'd love to see where the audience is joining from, where you're at, and those sorts of things. So just drop, if you don't mind, in the chat where you're listening from today, and we'll go ahead and get going here today. So what I wanted to do today, and the purpose of today, is to have a discussion around architecture, data, and integration, some of the more technical aspects of digital transformation. And it's also something that tends to get overlooked oftentimes. A lot of times organizations think that they can just put in new technology, but without the tying together of systems and thinking about system architecture and that sort of thing. So with that being said, we wanted to have Wayne Holtham on the show today, who is the vice president of our office, of the Third Stage office in Asia Pacific, based out of Brisbane, Australia. So it's very early in the morning there on a Saturday morning. So I really appreciate him joining here today on a Saturday morning. And not only is he the VP of our APAC office in Australia, but his background lends itself to the topic at hand today with the whole focus on architecture and integration, data migration. So that's a lot of stuff to talk about. We're gonna try and cover as much as we can and sort of scratch the surface of some of these topics here today. So all that being said, Wayne, thanks for being here today.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Eric.
Absolutely. It's always morning somewhere, right? Even if it's not.
That's right.
Where I am or others are. Well, so I guess just to start, we want to talk a bit in a few minutes here about architecture, data integration, and whatnot. But if you don't mind, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background and sort of how you came up in this space of digital transformation and basically what your core areas of competencies are.
I suppose I've been involved in a lot of the digital transformation rollout programs. So in the early days, there was a lot of on-premise, big scale SAP rollouts and different type systems. And as we've moved on in modern times, we've actually got now cloud. We've got a number of different ways, and it's more of a digital transformation than just implementing a solution. And so for probably the last 20, 30 years, I suppose, in some form there's been technology and it's evolved. And so for me, I've done everything from training people to actually designing architecture and solution architecture. And now I'm a bit passionate about the functional aspect of architecture that helps people get what they need out of a new transformation.
Got it. Great. Well, that's a great launching point or transition into my first question for you. And by the way, if anyone in the audience has questions as we're going through this discussion, feel free to chime in and add them to the chat box, and we'll get to questions as we're going here. So feel free to jump in at any point. But my first question for you, Wayne, is what exactly is system architecture? If we back up and just define it in the simplest terms, what does system architecture mean, and why is it so important to any sort of digital transformation?
I suppose the systems these days are a bit more complex than what they were in the past. Before, we would just put in a module, a system, and that would be it, and it'd be fairly self-contained. Whereas today, when we look at system architecture, it looks at a number of different levels. So it can be the cybersecurity, it can be the database layer, it can be the access into the system, because we have a lot of now remote apps that we want to actually incorporate information, capture information. It's also where the solution application sits. So the sort of modules, if we have, say, finance, we have asset management, we have materials, we have those sort of things. That's the applications. And so how they all fit together and work together is really what architecture or solution architecture is all about, or system architecture. And so many people talk about enterprise, but enterprise is about looking at, okay, all of these things working together, but then we have integrations between those. We have a number of different ways that we can actually link everything together to make it actually work as we would like it to work.
Right. So with the proliferation of different technologies and organizations that are going towards a best of breed model or multiple technologies to run their businesses, it's just a matter of tying those systems together and figuring out how how they all talk to each other and play together.
That's exactly right, and even your large scale, whether it's an Oracle or whether it's a SAP or those sorts of things, they have a model where they'll have things like success factors, or they'll have Concur. They essentially need integration, or they essentially need architecture to actually make them work together. They are, just because they're called or owned by SAP, they still need that connection and that view on how they will work together to get effectiveness.
Yeah, even if they're not separate products. So like if I'm using SAP S/4HANA or Oracle Cloud ERP or Microsoft Dynamics 365, whatever it is, you have different modules that do different things within that platform. And even then, you still have to do integration and define what that architecture is, even if you're not talking to third-party systems. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it's the architecture at that level is saying, well, okay, how do we actually want the different things to behave? Because we may set up our financial module to actually have a certain cost allocation methodology or whatever. And so we start to look at the other application and say, well, how do we actually set up the architecture to suit that? So we need to capture the information. We need to, provide that so that we can actually talk between the two on the same language as such. And that's what that architecture piece is looking for at that level.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe going a level deeper then. So we've covered how architecture is really the way different systems talk to one another and the way they interact and integrate. Maybe talk us through what is that integration? So like when you talk about integration, then what exactly are we talking about? Is it a process flow? Is it data going between systems? All the above, something different?
Well, actually, it's a bit of all of the above. So one thing could be just data flows. So what am I looking for from one module to the other? So that's the data flow. But the other one could be where I'm looking at connecting two separate modules, an external module or whatever. And so I want to be able to say, do I want that in real time? Do I want a two-way upload? So I want information to travel between the two. So they both have their own level of, accuracy at any one time. Or am I just looking for it to update as a batch type thing? So, it might be overnight. So that's where your integrations become, I suppose, a little bit more detailed, because as we link different modules together, we want to be able to say, well, if we're looking for a trusted source or a common source of information, we want them both to be on the same page. And we also want those, the information that they carry to actually either update each other. So that's where we start getting a bit more complex in what we call an integration as such, or how we set up those integrations.
Right. So what's an example? And do you have a specific example of a common integration point or a data handoff or a process workflow handoff between systems, or maybe a recent one that you've seen, just to help us understand just the basic definition of architecture and integration?
Yeah, a recent one I've been involved in is a CRM. So we have a customer interface where we have customers. We capture all of the customer information. So, if I've got, in this case, they had a connection, and so they had an account as such, and they were billed via the CRM or the customer module. But we also needed someone to go and connect. So we actually needed the other part of the system, the work management type system, to actually go and connect those customers, maybe do projects for those customers, respond to problems that the customers might have. So you don't want to capture the customer information in both places. So you need to actually have that information flow from one to the other. So the person who's going to connect or fix or do whatever has the customer details. And we also want to be able to go back and bill that customer. So we need to be able to have the flow back of information so that the billing can take place for the time spent and the materials used, sort of thing. So that's just a simple one, just between two modules, the CRM and your works management type. And then obviously you got your finance from there, because you've got to settle those accounts and make sure that the payment that's come in is recognized and is banked and posted and all those sort of things into a ledger account, sort of thing.
So I'm not a super technical person, and I suspect a lot of people listening that are executives in particular may not be as technical as someone like yourself or other people on our team. But if I hear that, I think, okay, that sounds pretty complicated. I don't want to have to deal with that if I can help it. So why don't I just go buy a single ERP system that just does all that stuff for me in a seamless, integrated way? Is is what you're saying, though, even if I do that, I still have to think that way. I still have to think about how that data is going to flow and integrate between the different modules. Is that true?
Yeah, that's exactly right. If I buy a single system that has a integrated or supposedly integrated CRM, then the data flow needs to be still considered. So how am I going to get that information and recognize that on my particular work order or my request for work and those sort of things. And so whether it's a data flow or whether it's two systems talking to each other, there's a level of architecture that's needed to make that happen.
Makes total sense. And we actually have a sort of a follow-up lead-in question that almost seems like it was perfectly timed, and it was perfectly timed. This is over on LinkedIn. Chad Shortridge asked a really good question related to what you were just talking about, Wayne, which is, how do you manage one source of truth for data? I think that's a $1 million question that a lot of organizations ask. We hear that a lot from our clients. How do you manage that single source of truth? If you have, say, in that example you gave, you've got your CRM system and your back office ERP, you're gonna have these data flows back and forth. Where is that single source of truth, and how do you manage it as such?
That is a great question, and it is probably one of the hardest things for organizations to work through when we talk about bringing in things like geospatial, and we talk about bringing in those sorts of things. So we say, well, who should be the master of that data? So, and I'll refer to an asset management type thing. So we'll have asset management where we have a number of different, pieces of equipment somewhere. And so, and there's characteristics about that piece of equipment that we want to hold in the asset management system. But we also want to be able to know where it is. So spatially, we want to know where it is, and often what we'll find is that there might be updates that happen spatially that we want to also have in our EAM. So you say, well, who should own that data? Which is the source of truth that we're actually looking for? And again, it's identifying who is the master, who should be the master of that. So if it's in that sort of situation, from a spatial, the master should be, locational, spatial, all those sort of things should actually be in that geospatial module, and the asset stuff should be characteristics about the history, about the performance of it, should all stay in the asset management space. If we look at it from a CRM side of things, where's the biggest customer interaction? So the customer data, customer information, addresses, their billing information should stay in that CRM, whereas the asset works should be able to just leverage certain aspects of that information. And so the master in that case should actually be the CRM component.
Yeah. So it depends on the type of data that you're talking about. You might have a different answer of where that single source of truth is, depending on what data you're talking about, whether it's a customer master or a product master or an asset master. Those are different answers that you might have for where that single source of truth resides.
Yeah, that's right. And where a lot of organizations struggle when it comes to the architecture piece is they try and have a replication in both systems, and that's where you have struggle with getting which is the source of truth as such. And so what you find is that there is a latency, always will be some sort of latency that's even what we call real time. If we're using, say, field mobility to capture things and we don't have connectivity for a particular point in time, and we've updated and completed some work, that's not going to find its way back into the system and update the CRM until, and there's that level of latency that happens there. And so we've also got to understand and manage that side of it.
Right. And before this interview, I was thinking to myself as we were prepping for this and thinking of the questions I wanted to ask you. I was thinking to myself, what, this might be the first topic where I can get through at least 20 or 30 minutes of discussion without asking you a question about change management. But you've triggered a change management question. I just can't help myself, and I have to ask you. So when you think about change management, and if I'm a end user, or if I'm a part of a project team that's leading a transformation, one of the worries I might have is that now if I have a single source of truth over here, but the data's flowing over here into different systems and different people are touching it, how do you ensure that you're not corrupting the data, or that your people, the human interaction isn't creating some sort of data issue? That might be a two-pronged question.
Yeah, that's a great question, because if you think what traditionally used to happen, we would come in from, or we try to put information in the system, we'd give it to someone, it might have been paper-based, they upload it and they do it in a consistent fashion. And so we sort of get some sort of consistency of what we have. Today, we actually open it up a lot more, where we actually say to people from, whether they be field workers, whether they be customers, even actually entering information through portals. And so we need to be able to make sure that we understand what we want them to put in, and where the challenges are in what they put in. And so the change piece, especially for internal employees, is something they've never had before. Why do I need to put all this information in? I never did it before. And so the change journey is really, really important for them to understand the why, so that then the information they put in becomes consistent. I'll give an example. When you're completing a piece of work, you have a choice to be able to put an additional comment. And someone who doesn't really understand why they're doing that and think that it's a bit of a burden on their time, they'll just put maybe a full stop. It satisfies the mandatory field that says that we needed data in there, but for everyone else, it's not really a beneficial input. And so you need to take those people on that journey. What's the importance of this? Who's going to use it? Why is it important? And you raise a very good point, because today we expect a lot more of an ERP, and a lot more people interact with an ERP system as an end-to-end.
Yeah, and so that behavioral piece becomes critical to ensuring that the architecture, the integration of data that you've spent so much time and effort and brain power trying to fix and make sure you get it right. You don't want the human interaction now to just throw that off track, and now you've got dirty data, or the integration isn't integrating good data between the systems as it should.
Yeah, that's right. And often part of the architecture piece there is that functional architecture. So am I going to have consistent catalogs that actually capture segments of information? So is it out of service? Is it broken? Is it in service? Those sort of things, as against someone putting in what they might call as a response that ends up being a text response. So you actually start to get some consistency, and that's where, again, architecture, the functional architecture piece sits in. So how's it going to function so that it will support the integration between some of these other modules? Because you want to limit what's going in there, but you want it to be consistent.
Right. So maybe shifting gears a little bit, and I'm sort of doing a flyover here, and then we'll come back and dive into more of this in more detail, and particularly if we have questions from the audience on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter, feel free to chime in Crowdcast as well. There's a few of you watching on Crowdcast. Make sure that you chime in with any questions you might have. But we've covered architecture and integration at a high level. We've started to touch on data at a high level. But maybe help us understand, just what is data migration? How does that fit into this whole picture of architecture and integration that we're talking about, or how does it fit into a transformation in general?
It's interesting, because in the past, when we've thought about data migration, we were changing a system. So we're actually saying, I have a system that I've been building data in, I've been capturing data, I have data that is master data. So it's that sort of thing, that it's information about certain things. It could be about my customers, it could be about my equipment or whatever. And then I have the transactional data. So what's that information where I've had process flows that, it might be work orders, it might be billing, it might be all of those sorts of things. And so in that world, we would take what we had in the past and take it into a new system. In today's world, we're starting to go, well, not only do we want that, we actually need to configure our data. So as I talked about those catalogs that we're talking about there, where we have the drop-down boxes, we need to configure and build all of the data that actually supports that. And so the migration piece becomes probably only about 20 or 30% of what people do today, from what they took out of their old system to what they're going to put into their new. But the 70% becomes, how do I satisfy the capability requirements I have now for this ERP? And that's where we get caught in the fact, when we price, or we see solution integrators come in, they'll actually price a project just on the migration piece. Well, what we find is that's a very minor piece today, and that's one of the gaps and that's where you get a lot of that over time and those sort of things, because the business all of a sudden has to actually document things that would have been done on paper before, or would have been done in a different way. And so that's it's a big area, and migration is definitely a larger piece, or providing information into the system to make it workable. The second piece is conversion, is the ability to be able to say, well, if I'm taking one system and putting it in, I might have a time period that I need to actually look forward on or past. And so some of that data migration also is conversion. So I need to take some of my old way of doing things and actually have them so that I've converted that data so it actually sits in the new system, but in a way that I can actually access it, just to get continuity of information. And so for some organizations, it might be just one financial period. For some other organizations, it could be many financial periods forward, just to be able to get that continuity of information.
Right. So when should organizations start this whole process? You know, if I'm going through a digital transformation as a company, or if I'm a leader in a company that's going through this, when should I start thinking about all this stuff we talked about, data, integration, architecture? Where does that fit in the grand scheme of things in the sequence of events?
I think the architecture piece becomes that we need to understand what are we trying to get out of the digital transformation. So is it that we actually want to widen our footprint? Or we might have many applications that sit outside today where we're doing duplication of effort, or with double entry and those sorts of things. So if we've got that view, we want to be able to say, well, okay, now what does that look like if we have a system which talks, all of the modules talk together and data flows well between each one? And so that's part of that strategy and architecture piece. And then we need to look at that from there and say, okay, well, what's that going to impact? Is it going to impact things like our cybersecurity? Do we have to upgrade that? Now we have other people coming in on BYO devices, bring your own device, so access becomes an issue because, we only want certain people accessing our system. And so we need the trusts and all of those sort of things put in place. And so that high level strategy is important to work out, what's this going to look like? How do we want it to function? And then obviously we cascade down into, so how would those interactions work? Do we want the same data in each system? Do we want, are we happy to be able to report out of each system individually? Have we got that capability? So these are all things that first strategy and understanding of what I'm trying to get out is an important step. And then obviously the detail comes in from there.
Right. Yeah. And you and I have had conversations with clients in the past. I know we've been in the same calls with clients where there's discussions about systems that this plethora of systems that have proliferated over time in their legacy environment. So they've got dozens or hundreds of different systems. And in some cases, the clients don't even know all the systems they have. They can't even identify or tell you or give you a document that defines where all the nooks and crannies are, these little point solutions that they've developed over time. So if I'm trying to define my roadmap going forward, how do I start untangling this web of stuff that I've created from an architecture and integration perspective? It's just sort of organically morphed into this massive mess that now I'm trying to replace with a modern technology. How do I get started on that, or what advice would you give to someone that's about to go down that path?
Well, it's trying to understand where the information comes from, and it's interesting. Like we were on an engagement recently, and we talked a bit about they had, I think, 400 applications that sat outside their main ERP system, and but in addition to that, we started to then think about, okay, how do we unpack that? And when we started to talk to them, we realized that the connecting thing was many spreadsheets, the world of Excel, and so when you start understanding how do you get information in, and where's the process flow, and what's this? Why do you put it in, and what are you doing? Then you start to unpack whether some of the systems that they have still need to be, still need to be kept on, or whether they can be made redundant as such. And so it does take a fair bit of unpacking with the organisation to actually really understand what it is and how they get information into their main system to maintain that system of truth. And many times the linkage is a duplicated spreadsheet or an upload or an access database and those sort of things that allow them to be able to do that.
Yeah, and it seems like this could be a work stream or a thread in the transformation that could either slow things down considerably or cause you to take longer than you might expect, just as bad, create sort of an obstacle or a prerequisite that you have to overcome before you can really deploy new technology, because you kind of have to know what systems am I going to decommission, which ones am I going to keep, what am I going to do with the data, how am I going to move the data. And if all I do is go pick a new system, let's just say I go pick SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, one of those big ERP systems. If that's all I do is just go pick one of them and say, okay, they gave me an 18-month implementation plan, I'm good to go. But you haven't considered, well, what does it mean to untangle this web of systems you have, and which ones you're going to keep, how you're going to tie it. Some of the ones you want to keep for regulatory reasons, or maybe it just fills a void that the new system may not have. It seems like that could really disrupt a project or make it very difficult to plan if you don't have a good handle on what that environment looks like. Would you agree with that, or what are your thoughts?
No, it really does, and it's one of those things that when people build in-house systems, or they've built isolated platforms, they build a level of detail in there that it's very hard for a mainstream to to be able to replicate. And so that's the challenge that you find, is when you actually go back to the business and say, we're putting in this solution that's going to be, wider across our footprint. And they go, but I need this particular piece of functionality, and to create it in the new system would be a lot of customization, a lot of heavy, complexity when it gets involved in developing that component to it. And so you've then got to try and work out, well, how valuable is what you're getting, or is that just a nice to have? Because that's where businesses do get confused sometimes, in the fact they love certain levels of functionality, but when you go, how do we use it? Well, they can't actually tell you that. And I think that's part of that discovery piece to do early, because once you get into the point where you've actually got the system solution architecture out there and the functionality side of it, and people start throwing these extra tool sets in, it becomes quite difficult to actually then accommodate that. And that's where you start, change becomes harder, acceptance becomes harder, and the pressure to actually build more customizations becomes much greater.
Right. Now, one question that sort of fits into all this, although it's a little bit different, or sort of a peripheral part of this whole concept of integration and architecture, is platform as a service. What exactly is that? I know that's a fairly big buzzword right now, and a lot of vendors are speaking to it or building that competency into their offering. What exactly is platform as a service, and how does it relate to everything we're talking about here today?
What platform as a service is doing is essentially, we have applications that are SaaS applications, subscription service applications. But then we also now we actually host things in a cloud. And what a lot of vendors found, that for them to host in the cloud, it didn't make sense, because there's a lot of infrastructure to be able to set those data centers up and be able to have the level of security and those sort of things in place. So what they've done now is offer a service called PaaS, which says, well, we'll combine the hosting piece, we'll combine the applications and all of the common integrations, and we'll offer that as a service. And so as a managed service as such. And so it's supposed to take out the complexity. It's also given vendors a chance to be able to probably increase a price point, because there's certain areas there which, because of the sort of way that they deploy it, it probably becomes a bit more expensive than a long-term perpetual license model that we've coming from as such. So that's where the PaaS bit sits in. It's trying to take out the complexity of all of those, the infrastructure layer as well as your application layer, and what it takes to be able to have the integrations between each and manage centrally is what they do.
Yeah, great point. And so, obviously, cloud and hybrid environments where you have cloud and on-premise, I suspect that creates some architecture or potential PaaS types, platform as a service types of challenges, or how does that fit? Just the whole.
Yeah, it does, because
how do you deploy technology.
It's interesting, because one of the things that we sort of in the past, we would have a data center in one of our rooms in our organization. So we had all of our servers running in there, and all of a sudden now we're actually saying, well, we're going to run all of our servers offsite somewhere else. And so where the challenge comes that you don't hear often with PaaS is the fact of that bandwidth connection of, how do I get all my data from where I am today, what I'm processing today, how do I get that back up to the host and back to me again? And so you need a fair bit of bandwidth to be able to do that. And so they offer the service of the data center, but they don't often talk about what it takes to go from your organization to the data center. And that's another cost that isn't considered. It's the infrastructure cost that needs to be put in place. So, it's one of the things that, I suppose is the unseen thing when we talk about cloud, because we can't just have a phone line, a telephone line, because the bandwidth isn't strong enough to be able to carry all of those transactions that we want to and from.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. And I would think with Internet of Things, cloud solutions, Industry 4.0 with some of the shop floor automation for manufacturing types of organization, artificial intelligence. It seems like with all that, the other emerging technologies, it seems like that puts even more pressure or adds to the importance of architecture and the stuff we're talking about. Because while that stuff's really cool, you have to figure out how it all ties together in your overall technology landscape.
Oh, very, very, very true. It's one of those things that and that's where the functional architecture piece starts to come in the sense that if we've got things like we want to put RPA in, we want to be able to do those. We want to be able to get consistency in our process. And so to get consistency, there's two ways. There's the way that people actually use the system, but there's also the way the data feeds between the different modules or the different applications as such. And so for us to be able to get efficiency from that perspective, we need to be able to make sure that the functional architecture works. It's consistent. It allows a robot to actually pick it up and say, I can match this with that so I can process it. Otherwise you end up where you get a lot of inconsistency and it's a pointless exercise actually having RPA. And that's one of the challenges of implementing RPA poorly. When we talk about, Industry 4.0, if we've got, things like demand and we're tying it up to our manufacturing, we want to be able to make sure that we've actually got a very, very consistent, concise way that it's, the manufacturing component is interpreting what our supply is, when that is, just in time, all of those sorts of things. So they're very, very closely tied together.
Now, are there certain types of software vendors or software solutions, I should say, that you feel like are more architecturally sound or more open or easier to work with from a end client perspective? So like when you look at SAP, I know you've done a lot of work with SAP with a lot of our bigger clients, but you've also worked with smaller ERP systems as the rest of our team has. But wait, are there any systems that sort of stand out as like these are really solid architectures, or maybe just different, or maybe you could just give us an example of one and why it's strong in some way?
It's interesting that I think where the challenge lies for many of the bigger players is they've come from this legacy of on-premise, and so they've got code which is really sitting on-premise, but they're trying to actually run it in a cloud instance. And this is where SAP and Oracle and those sort of larger organizations that really have a long history of ERP solutions that were on-premise and were quite functional. They were really mature and really advanced. And so to be able to take that next level to go to cloud, it takes a whole different way of thinking. Whereas when you look at something like, and just as a vendor, not to want to name too many, but Infor is one where they've developed a solution called M3, and for the manufacturing space, it's been built on cloud technology. Its whole premise of the way they actually constructed it sits. It was always meant to be a cloud solution, and so when you look at it, it has a lot better functionality because it's got that I suppose the way it was developed leverages what cloud offers or what modern infrastructure offers. Whereas if I look at the likes of some of the SAP stuff, it is still the maturity level in some areas end up where you struggle to actually get consistency of information back out of the system or flow of information through the system. So that's I think it's more of that purpose built, and SAP will get better, and they are getting better over time, but it's going to take a bit of time for them to get up. And I think Oracle's in that same boat where they're still leveraging old code and old thinking and haven't really embraced the full thing that cloud actually offers, or that those new technologies like RPA and Internet of the Future sort of thing, IoT.
Right. Now, speaking of Oracle and SAP and some of the other vendors you're talking about, if I just look at SAP and Oracle, they both emphasize the value of their databases. So Oracle started as a database company, and they take pride in the fact that they use Oracle databases for their product. And SAP used to use Oracle databases, now they use their own HANA platform. How does a database, without getting into too much technical detail, how important is that whole database structure when you think about an overall architecture? Is that something that really is important? Is it overrated? How would you classify that in the grand scheme of things?
Well, a database is probably getting more and more important, and I suppose where people would have thought that I would buy a database that was in SAP world, they've got HANA. In Oracle, they've got their own databases. And so you would say, well, I'd keep all of my data in that database. And so when I wanted to access that data, that I could access it back in a structured way. Whereas today we've actually got this concept of combining unstructured data, structured data, and we actually then want to actually take that data and actually report on it, review it, analyze it, and all of those sort of things. And so the problem that we're seeing with even HANA is the fact that that data is in there, but it doesn't really cope well with actually having other data brought in there. You can bring in the I suppose the analytics layer, you can blend data sources, but it's still hard to be able to get that modeling and those sorts of things. And so what you're finding now is a lot of the your hyperscalers offer things like data lakes and data hubs and those sorts of things where you store your data in there, and the HANA might contribute to that data lake, but it's not the sole source of data anymore. And so this whole view of just having a ERP or a solution with a database, and whether it be Oracle or whether it be SAP, we're finding that that's still not enough, especially with the amount of analytics, the amount of reporting, the amount of detail we want back across all of the applications that we have in our landscape.
Yeah, makes total sense. And speaking of analytics and reporting, then how does that fit into, or how do I tie this all together when I think about architecture, integration, data, and then the end result that we're all really trying to get at is a set of business processes and capabilities that help further our business, but B, we're also looking for those dashboards or reports, business intelligence, whatever you want to call it, that tells us how we're operating, or better yet, even helps us predict what might happen in the future. So how does that tie in? How does that whole concept of reporting and BI and analytics, how does that tie into this whole concept of architecture and integration? Where does it fit?
Well, it to me, it should actually fit right at the beginning, because when we're doing this strategy, it's okay, how will we know that what we're doing in the way we conduct our business and the way we use our technology, how will we know that that's actually working well for us? Sadly, it's always left to the last, because everybody goes, well, we'll just get a report out for that. But if you don't have the data structured appropriately, or you don't have the architecture between who's the master, who's not the master, what the flows of data are, then it's very hard to get consistent, accurate reporting to analyze and to monitor. So if we want to know processes are being done, carried out effectively, we need to be able to see that process is clear, but then where's all of the points that identify that at each step of the way that is actually being done as we had predicted or as we would like it to be. And so reporting becomes the bit at the start. We need to say, well, at this point here and this point here and this point here, here's where we would want information to be able to allow us to be able to see what's going on, how we're performing. And then once we've got that basis, then we can start to analyze where the gaps are. And so it's in my mind, as I said, I think it's the one of the first things when I'm talking about strategy, I talk about, well, what do you want to see out of this? How will you know you're doing well? Which is reporting and analytics as such. And so that informs then your whole architecture piece and also the complexity that you have between your different applications. So you might find that sometimes some people say, well, we'll put an API in here where it's a single way API, and sorry for the technology term, but it's a connector. API is a connector as such. But if I've only got a one-way flow and I'm looking to report out of a particular application, I'm not going to be able to get that. And so that's where it becomes important to understand what you want to get out and then build your system in not the most complex way, but the most functional way.
Yeah, that's super interesting because it seems like so many organizations we work with have the opposite thought. You started off by saying, unfortunately, people put this off oftentimes till the end. And it's almost like, oh yeah, we need to figure out what our reports are going to look like. And then you go look at the system or the technologies that you're deploying, and they've got thousands of options or thousands of different reports that are sort of canned vanilla reports, and you're trying to make sense of it all. You're not sure which ones you need or don't need. And so I think your point is really well taken, that the more you can start with the end state in mind, the better off you're going to have a clear strategy and roadmap to help you get there versus waiting till the end to define what the end state might look like.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting when you talk to most vendors, they say we've got, as you mentioned, a number of canned reports in there. But when you talk to the business, they go, that report doesn't really suit what we want, and it doesn't give us the information as we need. And usually it's premised on the basis of a vanilla or a standard solution. But when you actually start bolting things together and you start architecting things together, all of a sudden that changes dramatically. And I want information from this CRM now, whereas that was never in my ERP landscape to start with. And so they are the sort of things I need to consider when I'm talking about reporting, and then obviously the analytics piece that comes out of that.
Yeah, it kind of takes me back to a project I had really early in my career, my first 5 years of being in consulting. And one of the projects I had to do was for a big SAP implementation, and I had to go around to all the different departments and get sort of their as-is reporting. Like, just show me your reports. What is it you rely on? Show me the dashboards, whatever. And there were so many, and it was just so many of them that they couldn't even explain why they were running the report, who was using it, what they were doing with the information. They just had gotten in this routine of creating all these reports that in most cases they just weren't using, or as just one field, one piece of data on this big report that's really what they wanted. And so I had to go through, figure out the as is, and then sort of rationalize and narrow it down to what the real reporting needs were. But that whole process, that just took a lot of time. You're sort of relying on tribal knowledge and trying to reconstruct why and how you got to where you are today, and do you really need that going forward, and what should it look like going forward. That whole process, that can take time. That probably takes longer than just to deploy potential new reports, but you have to do it to be able to know sort of what that end state's going to look like.
Oh, you do, because some of those reports actually probably drive some of the processes or some of the ways that the organization operates. But the additional piece to that is interesting as we're moving forward to what we call trusted source. And the reason we want to be able to have a ERP or a digital transformation where we have a lot of modules all working together is that we have data that's consistent in one system as such, instead of in multitudes of systems. And when we talk about reporting, it's about saying, well, if I want to report out of this single system, how do I get that trusted information? Whereas in the past, we would maybe download it, put it in Excel, do a pivot, do some spreadsheets and those sorts of things, and we would report on that. How accurate is that? And I suppose that's the question that, as we go in the strategy piece, is that a really important thing for us to be able to have accuracy in the information we have to make better decisions? Or is it we're just happy with the fact that someone's got a spreadsheet and they've been able to present us information that we feel comfortable about? We maybe trust it based on the person that's maybe given it to us, but sometimes when you look into that, you see that they've filtered out some of those things that probably they didn't want people to see. And so it's that sort of thing about making sure that when we talk about reporting and that sort of stuff, that we do leverage the system that is this trusted source as such. And so understanding the architecture, how it's going to sit, you can see how it keeps building up the different layers, and reporting is one of those ones that probably unpacks many of the gaps and performance issues that the business has.
Right. Makes total sense. So maybe just as sort of a capstone question, sort of tie this all together and wrap up the conversation. What advice would you have for someone that's about to start on a transformation and they're maybe not sure what to do with this whole big work stream we're talking about here as we talk about architecture, integration, data, reporting? They don't really know what to do there. Maybe they've decided that they're going to deploy new technology or technologies. Maybe they've got the process improvement stuff figured out, the change management stuff figured out, project governance, all that other stuff that's really important, but they haven't figured out what to do here in this work stream. What are some of the key takeaways or things that you really want to make sure you keep in mind as you start down this path within this work stream?
Well, I suppose one of the first things is don't ask a technology vendor how to solve that problem, because they've got a whole price list book of how they'll solve that problem. I think the first stage is to be able to define your, and we call it strategy, but what does strategy mean? It's saying, well, how do we want to operate? What do we want to do? Is our business context still the same? And then out of that, so how much of our business do we actually want to have interacting with this system? And so that starts to then influence your architecture from that side of it. And then are we going to have external people in the system? So cybersecurity and access becomes one of the things we need to consider. So it's you sort of try and get an understanding of how you're going to work in your current business context and how it looks like it's going to be in the future, because it's no good planning just for what you do today. ERPs are around for 10, 15 years sort of thing. So you need to be thinking, okay, what is coming up? How do I get value out of this in the longer term? And so what is that going to look like? And that strategy piece is probably the most important, that an organization needs to look at itself and really understand its own level of maturity, because many people believe their maturity is much greater than it actually is. And it probably, over time, they've grown older and so they've grown more mature. But when it comes to how they maybe use the system, you sometimes find that that's eroded over time, because new people have come into the business. Processes that were defined initially aren't followed anymore. There's new workarounds. And so you need to take that step back and go, how mature are we? And how are we going to move to this next step? And that becomes change, but also understanding what do we want to be when we grow up. And that's a saying you say often, Eric, and it's one that I really resonate with, because many people think they've grown up, but they don't understand there's a whole new level to grow up to, sort of thing. So.
Yeah, and that's actually a great closing comment for really any aspect of transformation. I mean, certainly for what we're talking about here today, it's relevant, as far as defining where we want to be when we grow up and how mature we are today versus how mature we might want to be in the future. But that you can say the same thing for your future state business processes and what you want your processes to look like, and the organizational design and the change management that goes along with that. What do we want that part of the organization to look like? So it really is, really this should be right up there on par with the other parts of the transformation in terms of defining what is that end state vision, what do we want it to look like, and how are we going to get there, and avoiding that temptation to say, well, I don't really need to worry too much about it because it's complicated. It sounds confusing. I'm just going to go buy an off-the-shelf ERP system or some sort of enterprise technology that's going to solve that problem for me. And that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make, is just to assume that the silver bullet is going to define all this stuff for you. You still have to do this hard work regardless of what technology you do or don't deploy.
That's right. And it helps you along the way when you're implementing as well, because once you've got that understanding of what the future looks like, or what you really wanted it to be like, and how you would see that, then as you get implementing, you find that there's challenges come up along the way, and the potential is that, we need to increase scope or we need to change direction. If it doesn't satisfy back to how we're operating, then we need to really question whether those changes are valid changes as such, because and so it helps us get to that point of what are we delivering and what's that going to look like early on, so we can actually monitor that all the way through, and it puts less risk on the fact that we're actually going to go off track or have a tangent or do those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes total sense. Good, solid advice. So sound advice. I appreciate you sharing that point and all the points you shared here today. I really appreciate you being here today. So thanks for joining our weekly podcast, especially early in the morning your time. Really appreciate you joining.
No, it's great to be part of it. Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thanks to the audience for joining here today. If you don't mind, share this video or share this recording with any colleagues you think that might be interested. So if you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, just share the link if you don't mind. I'm sure there's others out there that might be interested in the same topic, especially if you're on a team that's working on this sort of thing and looking for more guidance on that. We'd love to help out whoever we can. So thank everyone for joining. Hope you all have a great weekend, and we will see you all soon. We do these weekly live streams every Friday. Usually it's at 2 p.m. Eastern time in the United States or in the Americas. Today we did it 2 hours later, simply so Wayne wouldn't have to be up at 4 a.m. his time. Instead, he's up at 6 a.m., which is still, I'm not up at 6 a.m. on Saturday, so I appreciate you being awake at 6 a.m. on a Saturday to do this. And so join us every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern in the United States or the Americas, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you.
All right, thanks again, Wayne.
See ya.